studying Journey into Bhutan and desperate to get the full 22 out of 22 for your question 5. Let me give you some help, and this time we've got a really random comparison to make with some cheeky Dickens. Stay tuned, get higher grades. Yes, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
Abbiamo il cuore a strisce, portaci dove vuoi.
So this question is out of 22. At the top end, what are we looking for? Varied and comprehensive range of comparisons covering both texts as a whole. You also need some brief analysis of each quotation using subject terminology. Make sure that your response is balanced. You must have a reasonably equal split between the two texts. I think an introduction is important for question 5, whereas there probably isn't time for one in question 4. Sum up the two texts in relation to the question within this introduction and include an initial similarity difference. You should have 4 chunky paragraphs after your introduction. Start each paragraph with a comparative statement, such as both texts suggest this. This can be reasonably simple, but you should then dissect this similarity by pointing out a way in which the similarity is treated differently within the two texts. Always ensure that you use quotations, short ones, to back up your points, and you need to analyse them briefly. You should also develop or extend your initial similarity mid-paragraph, and once again back up your points with analysed quotations from both texts. This video is going to explore this question. Compare how the writers present their ideas and perspectives about their experiences. Time for you to have a read through the text if you've not already done this. They will appear at 5-second intervals. Press pause now.
Remember the principle. Start each main paragraph, of which there's 4, with a comparative statement beginning with both. Then, in the second sentence, explain how this similarity is presented differently in the two texts.
Typically, it will look something like this. Why not look back at the text now and try to jot down 4 of these, which could potentially be used to kick off your 4 main paragraphs. Go on, give it a go. Press pause now. Fancy a gander at my topic sentences? You're in luck. They're about to appear on screen at 5-second intervals. You've got this. Press pause now. Time now for you to have a go. Write a full question 5, remembering to use topic sentences at the beginning of each main paragraph, in which you first state a similarity and then explain how the similarity is presented differently within each text. Back up your points with quotations from each text, and develop your initial point mid-paragraph, with this development once again being backed up by quotations from each text. You also need to include an introduction in which you summarise each text in relation to the question and introduce an initial comparative point. What are you waiting for? Write that fabulous essay. Aim for 22 out of 22. The text will reappear now at 3-second intervals. Press pause now.
How did you get on? Produce a delicious 22 out of 22 response. Time to compare your response with mine.
Text 1 is an extract from Dickens's Pictures from Italy, in which the fabled 19th century novelist eulogises about beautiful Verona, past and present. Text 2 is Zeppa's more ambivalent account of Bhutan, a mountainous region with terrible long-life food. In text 1, Dickens clearly takes great delight in historical architecture, whereas in text 2, Zeppa is perhaps more interested in the people and their history rather than the town or the somewhat overwhelming landscape. Both texts present writers mesmerised by foreign surroundings. However, in text 1, Dickens is entranced by the architecture of the city of Verona, whereas Zeppa is overwhelmed by the mountainous backdrop of Bhutan. Dickens's delight is seen at the very beginning of the extract. Pleasant Verona, with its beautiful old palaces, with its Roman gates. The short exclamative sentence and the subsequent use of anaphora show Dickens' enthusiasm about the historic architecture and grand buildings within the city centre. In contrast, Bhutan is far less built up, and instead newly arrived Zeppa is struck by the scale of the natural landscape which surrounds Thimphu. She writes, mountains all around, climbing up to peaks, rolling into valleys, again and again. This grammatically incomplete sentence suggests that Zeppa feels breathlessly overcome by the presence of so many huge peaks and the vast distances between summits and her current altitude. Dickens describes Verona on a much smaller scale and clearly feels enamoured by its sense of history. He refers to the Roman gates casting on the sunlight of today the shade of 1500 years ago. Clearly, part of the charm is the fact that this city has existed for such a long time, yet has remained so picturesque and beautiful. In contrast, Zeppa initially feels more bewildered rather than charmed by the Bhutanese landscape. She struggles to understand how this mountainous landscape was once formed, and instead suggests that it is easier to picture a giant child gathering earth in great armfuls. This imagery suggests that she feels there is something haphazard and seemingly chaotic about the huge land masses which surround her. Both texts present individuals who feel inspired by these new foreign surroundings and experiences. However, in text 1, part of Dickens's enthusiasm stems from Verona's association with Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, whereas in text 2, Zeppa's two fellow teachers seem far more excited than Zeppa herself. In the opening paragraph to text 1, Dickens refers to quaint old quiet thoroughfares where shouts of Montagues and Capulets once resounded. The imagery here sees Dickens imagining Shakespeare's two warring families in the streets of Verona. The literary association clearly adds to his enjoyment of the scene. In contrast, Zeppa seems more ambivalent about Thimphu, unlike seasoned travellers Lorna and Sasha. This pair are both ecstatic about Bhutan, leaving Zeppa to hope to pick up some of their enthusiasm. In text 1, Dickens's ardour is hardly ever muted in the same way, with the exception of his reference to an art gallery whose pictures were so abominably bad. The adverb confirms Dickens's disdain for the quality of the artwork, but this doesn't change the overall joyous mood of the passage. In contrast, Zeppa isn't just ambivalent about the landscape, she's also damning about the food available. She references a breakfast of instant coffee, powdered milk, plasticky white bread, and flavourless red jam. The adjectives suggest a depressing lack of freshness in the food, whilst also indirectly emphasising the disadvantages of the remoteness of the location. Both texts reference locals who seem very different to those from the writer's home countries. However, in text 1, the local seems inept and old, whereas in text 2, the locals seem attractive and highly competent. In text 1, Dickens describes a man in charge of a collection of remains who might have been an Etruscan relic himself. This hyperbolic image links the man with ancient Etruria, a civilization at its height in 500 BC. The implication is clearly that this man is extraordinarily old, too old to be taking on any kind of tourist role. In contrast, Zeppa is far more complimentary about Bhutanese locals and agrees with an historical quotation which describes them as the best built race of men I ever saw. Whereas the local in text 1 is decrepit and inept, in text 2 Zeppa admires the physicality of the Bhutanese, including their beautiful aristocratic faces. Meanwhile, in text 1, Dickens is far less impressed with the elderly local who had not enough voice enough to be audible when he described the curiosities. To some extent, Dickens feels frustrated by this, as it meant that he wasn't able to understand more about the remains from very different cultures and civilizations. Whereas Dickens's local is inept with tourists, Zeppa finds a young man at a hotel who gives her directions politely in impeccable English. The adverb politely suggests excellent manners, whilst the adjective impeccable implies, rather incongruously given the remoteness of Bhutan, that this local at least has managed to learn an alien language, including its complex grammatical structures. Finally, both texts show writers acutely aware of the role played by history within these foreign lands. However, in text 1, Dickens seems most interested in archaic practices from the past, whereas Zeppa has a broader interest in the evolution of Bhutan and its exotic place names. In text 1, Dickens refers to the great Roman amphitheatre in the Piazza di Bra. He describes this in detail and recalls its violent past in which the fierce thousands hurried in and out, intent upon the bloody shows of the arena. The adjectives fierce and bloody show Dickens's vivid imagination and engagement with the past, which saw deadly gladiatorial combats take place during Roman times. Rather than emphasise a violent past, Zeppa enjoys referencing past names for Bhutan and its districts. These included the southern land of medicinal herbs and the Rainbow District of Desires. Zeppa clearly loves these longer names, which include explicit references to the beautiful natural world. There are also references to the natural world surrounding Verona in text 1, with the lovely panorama closed in by the distant Alps. However, the adjective distant confirms the key difference between the two texts. The mountains are only a background feature in Verona, whereas in Bhutan they are inescapable. Bhutan is all and only mountains. Perhaps this is one of the main reasons the country was never colonised, something Zeppa deeply respects. She ends her account by writing, "I'm full of admiration for this small country that has managed to look after itself so well." Zeppa may be impressed by Bhutan's historic independent spirit, but she never comes close to expressing the same levels of excitement and enthusiasm for Bhutan as Dickens does for Verona. Why does this get the full Monty 22? Well, remember that the middle bullet point of the mark scheme asks for analysis of writers' ideas and perspectives, including how theme, language and or structure are used across the text. This means that post-quotation you need to do a little bit of AO2 analysis, as I do here when I reference the short exclamative sentence and the subsequent use of anaphora, with its, before suggesting that this shows Dickens' enthusiasm for the historic architecture and grand buildings of Verona. When the first word of the question is compare, it's so important that you keep doing this. as opposed to simply talking about the different texts sequentially. Within this section, I dissect the similarity about the individuals in both texts being inspired by the foreign surroundings by pointing out that some of Dickens' enthusiasm comes from the Shakespeare link, whereas actually it's Zeppa's two new colleagues who are more enthusiastic than herself. Phrases such as in contrast, more plus adjective, and in the same way can be very useful when comparing. When it comes to comparing, I'm also a big fan of the whereas structure, which forces comparisons to be more precise. There's two in this section. Whereas the local in text 1 is decrepit and inept, in text 2 Zeppa admires the physicality of the Bhutanese, including their beautiful aristocratic faces. And whereas Dickens's local is inept with tourists, Zeppa finds a young man at a hotel who gives her directions politely in impeccable English. Notice two signals in this paragraph that this is the final paragraph and that I will be bringing this essay to a close. Finally, comma at the beginning of the paragraph, and then the final three sentences which refer to the way Zeppa ends her account and makes a summative point about the general levels of enthusiasm for the foreign lands across the two texts.
This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, helping you nail question 5, looking at Journey into Bhutan. Many thanks for watching.